Danielle Brooks, a poised and professional black woman, stepped onto the airplane, her tailored black suit accentuating her calm but commanding presence. The week had been brutal, endless board meetings, passive-aggressive colleagues, and the suffocating weight of being underestimated. Yet, here she was, clutching her leather briefcase as she made her way to seat 23B. The flight was full, a cacophony of voices and carry-ons. She exhaled deeply, silently praying for an uneventful ride home. In the row ahead sat Gregory Wallace, a middle-aged man whose tailored blazer and monogrammed cufflinks screamed wealth. He was the sort of man who didn't just walk into a room. He assumed it was his. Gregory's eyes darted to Danielle as she placed her bag in the overhead bin. His lips curled in distaste, his glance lingering on her for a moment too long. The polite smile Danielle offered him was returned with a smirk, the kind that spoke volumes without uttering a word. Danielle sat down and opened her book, The New Jim Crow. She tried to lose herself in the pages, but Gregory's grumbling pulled her attention. He was talking to the flight attendant, his voice loud enough to draw stares. "Is there any way to switch seats? I didn't realize I'd be so cramped here." He shot a pointed glance toward Danielle, who refused to look up, even as her grip on the book tightened. "I'm sorry, sir," the flight attendant replied with practiced diplomacy, "but the flight is fully booked." Gregory huffed and slumped back into his seat, muttering, "Figures." Danielle didn't react. She was used to this. Men like Gregory who acted as if the world should bend to their whims. The plane took off, and Danielle focused on her reading, doing her best to ignore the occasional glares from Gregory. Halfway through the flight, turbulence struck. The plane shook violently, eliciting gasps and nervous whispers. Danielle closed her eyes, her fingers gripping the armrests. She hated flying, but she refused to show fear. Beside her, Gregory clicked the call button incessantly. "Can we get a drink service here? This is unacceptable," he barked when the flight attendant finally arrived. "Sir, we're in turbulence. It's not safe to serve drinks right now." Gregory scoffed. "Not safe? Then why are we even in the air?" "Unbelievable." His voice carried across the cabin, drawing uneasy glances from other passengers. As the turbulence subsided, Danielle felt Gregory shift in his seat. "You know," he began, his voice dripping with condescension, "I'm surprised you're even reading that book. A bit heavy-handed for someone like you, isn't it?" Danielle turned to him, her gaze icy. "And what exactly do you mean by someone like me?" Gregory smirked, but before he could answer, the flight attendant appeared again, offering snacks. Finally, Gregory muttered, grabbing a pack of pretzels and ripping it open. He spilled some onto Danielle's tray table, but didn't bother apologizing. The tension between them was palpable, and the other passengers could feel it. When Danielle excused herself to use the restroom, Gregory took the opportunity to speak loudly to the man next to him. "Entitled, aren't they? Always making everything about race." He chuckled, as if he'd cracked a private joke. When Danielle returned, the man beside Gregory was visibly uncomfortable. She caught the tail end of their conversation and paused, her hands trembling. She sat down silently, her jaw clenched. She wanted to say something, to demand an explanation, but the humiliation of confronting him in front of the other passengers felt overwhelming. The flight dragged on, the air between them heavy with unspoken animosity. When the plane finally landed, Gregory stood abruptly, shoving past Danielle without so much as a glance. As she disembarked, she heard him arguing with a gate agent, complaining about the subpar service. Danielle walked through the terminal, her steps measured. She refused to let him have the last word, not because she needed to prove anything to him, but because she needed to reclaim her own dignity. She found Gregory at baggage claim, still grumbling to anyone who would listen. "Excuse me," Danielle said, her voice clear and unwavering. Gregory turned, his smug expression faltering as he faced her. "Yes? You seem to have a lot to say about people like me. I thought I'd give you a chance to say it to my face." A small crowd of passengers gathered, their curiosity piqued. Gregory's face reddened. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I think you do," Danielle replied. "You've spent this entire flight making it clear you think you're better than everyone else. But here's the thing. Your arrogance doesn't make you superior. It just makes you small. The onlookers murmured in approval. Gregory opened his mouth to retort, but no words came out. Danielle picked up her bag and walked away, her head held high. She didn't look back. Gregory Wallace's voice boomed across the terminal like a clanging bell. "She doesn't belong here," he barked, his words slicing through the usual hum of baggage claim chatter. His face was flushed, a mix of indignation and righteous fury, and his eyes darted toward Danielle, who stood a few feet away, waiting patiently for her suitcase to emerge from the carousel. The murmur of passengers around them grew louder, people pausing mid-step to witness the commotion. Danielle turned slowly, her composure a stark contrast to Gregory's blustering. Her dark eyes met his icy glare, and for a moment, the entire terminal seemed to hold its breath. She had dealt with racism her whole life. Sharp barbs veiled in politeness, microaggressions cloaked as jokes, but this was different. Gregory wasn't hiding. His words hung in the air like a challenge, daring her to respond. And she would. But not yet. "Excuse me?" Danielle said, her voice calm, controlled. The kind of voice that didn't need to shout to be heard. Gregory crossed his arms, his bravado growing with the attention of the crowd. "You heard me," he snapped. "People like you are always pushing your way into places you don't belong, taking up space, acting like you're entitled to everything." Danielle's fingers tightened around the handle of her briefcase. "And what exactly do you mean by people like me?" she asked, the edge in her voice sharp enough to cut. Gregory sneered, his disdain barely concealed. "You know exactly what I mean. You've got that chip on your shoulder, always playing the victim. Well, let me tell you something. The world doesn't owe you anything, sweetheart." The murmurs around them grew louder, and a woman nearby gasped audibly. A young man in a hoodie pulled out his phone, angling it discreetly to record the scene. Danielle noticed, but didn't let her gaze waver from Gregory. "I see," Danielle said finally, her voice steady. "You think because you've decided I'm beneath you, I should just shrink away and make you comfortable? Is that it?" Gregory rolled his eyes dramatically. "Oh, spare me the lecture. I've worked hard for everything I have. I didn't get handed anything just because I cried discrimination." Danielle let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "You think you know my story?" she said, stepping closer. "Let me tell you something, Gregory. I've worked twice as hard, for half the credit, just to get where I am. While you've coasted on your privilege, I've had to fight for every inch of ground." Gregory opened his mouth to reply, but Danielle raised her hand, cutting him off. Her voice grew louder, carrying over the gathered crowd. "And yet, here you are, trying to tear me down in front of all these people. Why? Because you can't stand the thought of someone like me holding her head high?" The tension in the air was electric. Gregory's face darkened, and he sputtered for a moment, his confident facade cracking. "Don't make this about race," he snapped, his voice rising. "This has nothing to do with that." "Oh, doesn't it?" Danielle countered, her tone scathing. "You saw me, saw the color of my skin, and decided I didn't belong. You couldn't handle the idea that I might be your equal, or worse, your better." The crowd murmured in agreement, a few nodding along. Gregory's discomfort was palpable now, his eyes darting around as if looking for an escape. But Danielle wasn't done. "You want to talk about not belonging?" she continued. "Look around you, Gregory. These people, every single one of them, is witnessing you humiliate yourself. Not me. You." Gregory's face burned red, his jaw tightening as he clenched his fists. "You're just proving my point," he spat. Loud, aggressive, and always looking for a fight. Danielle took a step closer, her voice dropping to a low, firm tone that commanded attention. "And you? Weak, entitled, and always looking for someone to blame. You think shouting down a black woman makes you powerful? It doesn't. It just makes you pathetic." A smattering of applause broke out in the crowd, and Gregory's head whipped around, his face twisted in disbelief. "What the hell is wrong with all of you?" he demanded, gesturing wildly at the onlookers. "You're encouraging this? This is why everything's falling apart." Danielle let the applause wash over her, drawing strength from the support. She could feel the tide turning, the weight of Gregory's hatred crumbling under the collective judgment of the crowd. Then, with deliberate slowness, Danielle turned back to the carousel and retrieved her suitcase, the wheels clicking softly as she pulled it behind her. She paused before walking away, glancing back at Gregory one last time. "You don't get to decide where I belong," she said, her voice calm and resolute. "And for the record, I belong everywhere." The crowd parted for her as she strode toward the exit, leaving Gregory behind, a man diminished by his own words. The hum of conversation returned, and the recording phones went dark, but the memory of what had transpired lingered in the air. Gregory stood frozen, the crowd's judgment pressing down on him. His bluster had failed, his superiority shattered. For the first time, he was forced to confront the truth. Danielle Brooks was not someone to be dismissed. She was someone to be reckoned with. Gregory Wallace was fuming. His attempts to arrange a transfer to another seat had been flatly denied by the flight attendants. "I don't understand why you can't make an exception for me," he barked. "I'm a paying customer, and I have a right to be comfortable." Across the aisle, Danielle Brooks sat quietly, her fingers gliding over the screen of her phone. Her calm demeanor contrasted starkly with Gregory's growing tantrum. She ignored his huffs and exaggerated gestures, but when his voice began to rise again, she decided it was time to act. "This is Danielle Brooks," she said into her phone, her voice measured and steady. "We need your help. We're on flight 1579, and there's been an incident." Her words, soft but resolute, carried through the cabin like a ripple in still water. Passengers turned their heads, curiosity flickering in their eyes. A man too rose up, shifted in his seat, his attention peaked, while a young woman across the aisle subtly leaned closer. Danielle ended the call and slipped her phone into her pocket, her face betraying no emotion. "What incident?" Gregory snapped, swiveling in his seat to glare at her. "What nonsense are you stirring up now?" Danielle tilted her head, her eyes narrowing slightly. "The kind of incident where a grown man repeatedly disrespects and belittles someone who has done nothing to him." "You're unbelievable," Gregory sneered. "Always playing the victim, always looking for someone to blame. You people are exhausting." The murmurs among the passengers grew louder, whispers passing like currents in the cabin. Gregory seemed oblivious to the judgment in their eyes. He leaned forward, his voice dripping with disdain. "Let me guess. You think calling someone is going to scare me? I don't care who you know." Danielle turned to face him fully, her gaze unwavering. "It's not about who I know," she said, her voice a low, steady beat. "It's about holding people accountable. Something you seem unfamiliar with." Gregory opened his mouth to retort, but the flight attendant appeared before he could speak. Her expression was tight, her professionalism stretched thin. "Sir, I must insist that you lower your voice and remain seated. This is absurd." Gregory spat, his voice carrying across the rows. "Do you have any idea who I am? I've flown with this airline for years, and this is how I'm treated? Because of her?" The flight attendant's patience visibly waned. "Sir, please calm down. If you cannot comply, we will have to take further action." Danielle folded her hands neatly in her lap, her calmness only fueling Gregory's outrage. "This is harassment," he continued, throwing a hand in Danielle's direction. "She's the one causing the disturbance, not me." "Disturbance?" Danielle interjected, her voice cutting through his rant. "You've done nothing but disrupt this flight from the moment you boarded. The only disturbance here is your fragile ego." Laughter broke out from a passenger in the back row, quickly muffled, but not before Gregory's head snapped in the direction of the sound. His face burned red, his fury bubbling over. "You think this is funny?" he snarled. "You think you can humiliate me like this?" "No one needs to humiliate you, Gregory," Danielle said. "You're doing that just fine on your own." The murmurs turned into soft chuckles, a few passengers unable to contain their amusement. Gregory's eyes darted around, his indignation deepening as he realized he was losing control of the situation. Before he could respond, a man in a sharp navy suit approached from the front of the plane. His badge gleamed under the cabin lights, and his presence silenced the growing whispers. "Good evening," the man said, his tone authoritative but calm. I'm Agent Bradley from the Federal Aviation Administration. I understand there's been a situation here. Gregory froze, his bravado faltering for the first time. Situation? What situation? This is all a misunderstanding. Agent Bradley's gaze shifted to Danielle, who met his eyes with a nod. Ms. Brooks, could you explain what's been happening? Danielle recounted the events calmly, her voice unwavering as she described Gregory's repeated attempts to demean her. She kept her tone factual, detailing his remarks and disruptive behavior without embellishment. The other passengers listened intently, their silence an unspoken agreement with her account. When she finished, Agent Bradley turned to Gregory. Sir, is there anything you'd like to add? Gregory sputtered, his confidence visibly eroding under the scrutiny. She's exaggerating. I didn't do anything wrong. This is just another one of those setups. Agent Bradley raised an eyebrow. Setups? Gregory's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. You know what I mean, he muttered, avoiding eye contact. I don't. Actually, Agent Bradley replied. What I do know is that this behavior is unacceptable on a flight. If it continues, we'll have no choice but to remove you upon landing. Is that clear? Gregory's shoulders slumped, his indignation draining away. Fine, he muttered, sinking back into his seat. Whatever. Agent Bradley nodded and walked away, his presence stilling the air like a storm had passed. Danielle watched him go before settling back into her seat, her hands relaxed on her lap. Gregory fumed silently, his face a mask of suppressed rage. The humiliation of being publicly called out, of having his privilege challenged so openly, was a wound to his pride that he wouldn't soon forget. The passengers around him exchanged knowing glances, their judgment hanging like a shadow over his seat. Danielle closed her eyes, the corners of her lips twitching upward ever so slightly. The fight wasn't over, but she had already won. As the flight began its descent, the captain's voice broke through the cabin's murmur. Ladies and gentlemen, we want to inform you that we are handling a situation requiring immediate intervention upon landing. Please remain seated until further notice. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted. Passengers exchanged glances, their curiosity heightened. Danielle Brooks, still seated with an air of calm defiance, felt the weight of every eye in the plane. Gregory Wallace, however, sank deeper into his seat, his expression dark with unease. His earlier bravado had been chipped away, but traces of resentment lingered. When the plane landed, the doors opened to reveal two uniformed officers waiting in the jet bridge. Officer Jonathan Crane, a tall man with a steady gaze, led the way, his every movement radiating authority. Beside him was Officer Emily Carter, whose sharp eyes scanned the cabin as she stepped inside. Both wore the polished demeanor of professionals accustomed to diffusing tension. Passengers watched intently as the officers conferred briefly with the flight attendants before making their way toward Danielle. Officer Crane approached her first, his voice low but firm. Ms. Brooks, I'm Officer Crane, and this is Officer Carter. Are you all right? Danielle nodded, her composure unwavering. I'm fine, thank you. Officer Carter crouched slightly to meet Danielle's gaze. We've been briefed about the events on board. If there's anything you'd like to add, now would be the time. Danielle recounted Gregory's actions with the same measured tone she had used earlier. She detailed his repeated attempts to intimidate her, his outbursts, and the pointedly racist comments that had escalated the tension. Her calm delivery belied the storm she had endured, but the officers didn't miss the gravity of her words. When Danielle finished, Officer Crane nodded. Thank you for your cooperation, Ms. Brooks. We'll take it from here. The officers turned to Gregory, who had been fidgeting in his seat. His earlier indignation had given way to visible discomfort, but his defiance flared when the officers approached. This is ridiculous, Gregory blurted, his voice rising again. I've done nothing wrong. She's the one causing all this chaos, and now you're treating me like a criminal. Sir, Officer Crane said, his tone calm but unyielding. We've received multiple accounts of your behavior during the flight. We need to address this matter. Please stand up. I'm not standing up, Gregory snapped, crossing his arms like a petulant child. I won't be humiliated any further. This whole thing is a setup. Passengers muttered among themselves, some shaking their heads at Gregory's behavior. A man a few rows back muttered, "What a clown," earning a few chuckles. Officer Carter's voice remained steady. "Mr. Wallace, we need your cooperation. If you refuse to comply, we'll have no choice but to escort you forcibly." "Escort me?" Gregory scoffed, his laugh devoid of humor. "For what? Saying something she didn't like? You can't seriously be taking her side." "Mr. Wallace," Officer Crane said, stepping closer, "this isn't about sides. It's about your conduct, which has been deemed disruptive and offensive. Now, I'm going to ask you one last time to stand up." Gregory's face flushed, and his voice dropped into a bitter snarl. "This is what's wrong with the world today. People like her can cry racism, and everyone jumps to their defense." The audible gasp from passengers was followed by a tense silence. Officer Carter's jaw tightened, but she maintained her professionalism. "That's enough, Mr. Wallace," she said. "Stand up now." Reluctantly, Gregory rose to his feet, his movements stiff with resistance. As Officer Crane guided him toward the exit, Gregory turned to Danielle one last time, his voice dripping with venom. "I hope you're happy," he sneered. "Playing the victim always pays off, doesn't it?" Danielle met his glare with a calm, unflinching gaze. "The only victim here," she said evenly, "is your own dignity." The response drew a ripple of applause from the passengers, their solidarity washing over the cabin. Gregory's face burned with humiliation, but he couldn't retaliate. He was led off the plane, his departure punctuated by the whispers and disapproving stares of the crowd. Once Gregory was gone, Officer Carter returned to Danielle. "Ms. Brooks, I want to thank you for your composure throughout this ordeal. We'll be filing a report on his behavior, and the airline will follow up with further action." "Thank you," Danielle said. "I appreciate your support." As the officers exited the plane, the passengers began to gather their belongings, the tension finally lifting. Several people approached Danielle, offering quiet words of encouragement. A young woman placed a hand on Danielle's shoulder. "You handled that with so much grace," she said, her voice filled with admiration. "I don't know how you kept your cool." Danielle smiled faintly. "Sometimes, the best way to fight back is to stay calm. People like him thrive on attention. I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction." As Danielle exited the plane and stepped into the terminal, she felt a mix of exhaustion and resolve. Gregory Wallace's behavior had been a glaring reminder of the challenges she faced, but it had also revealed the quiet strength she carried within her. She had stood her ground, and in doing so, she had reclaimed her dignity. The world outside the terminal bustled on, indifferent to the events that had unfolded. But for Danielle Brooks, it was another victory in a lifetime of battles, another step forward in her unwavering journey of resilience. Gregory Wallace stood frozen at the front of the plane, his face a deep crimson as Officer Jonathan Crane fixed him with a pointed stare. Beside him, Officer Emily Carter held a phone handed to her by a passenger, the screen playing a video of Gregory's earlier tirade in vivid detail. Every condescending sneer, every racist remark, and every demeaning gesture was captured with damning clarity. "You can't be serious," Gregory blurted, his voice rising. "She's the one who started this. She's been provoking me from the moment I sat down. She's the cause of all the problems." The passengers, now openly invested in the unfolding drama, exchanged incredulous glances. A man in the back muttered, "This guy doesn't know when to quit," earning a few quiet chuckles. Danielle Brooks, still seated, remained calm, her expression betraying nothing as she observed the spectacle. Officer Carter stopped the video and looked at Gregory, her gaze icy. "Mr. Wallace, this video clearly shows your disruptive behavior. Your comments and actions violated airline conduct policies, and they were offensive and discriminatory. You need to leave the plane now." Gregory's indignation flared, his chest puffing out as he pointed toward Danielle. "This is outrageous. That video doesn't show the full story. She was sitting there with that smug look, acting like she owns the place. People like her always think they can get away with anything." "Enough," Officer Crane said sharply, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Your behavior has already caused a delay, and we're not going to entertain any further excuses." Either you leave voluntarily, or we will escort you off the plane. Gregory's eyes darted around the cabin, searching for an ally, but all he found were stony glares and folded arms. Even the passengers who had initially stayed quiet now looked openly disgusted. A woman in the front row shook her head and muttered, "Unbelievable." Desperation crept into Gregory's voice. "This is discrimination. I have rights. You can't just throw me off like I'm some criminal." Officer Carter stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "Mr. Wallace, you are not being singled out because of who you are. You are being removed because of what you've done. And if you continue to escalate, you may face further consequences." Gregory's mouth opened, a sharp retort on the tip of his tongue, but Officer Crane cut him off. "Final warning, Mr. Wallace. We're not here to debate. Let's go." The weight of the situation seemed to finally sink in. Gregory huffed loudly, his face a mask of fury as he grabbed his carry-on bag. As he turned to leave, he shot one last venomous glare at Danielle. "You'll regret this," he hissed, his voice low but filled with malice. Danielle didn't flinch. She met his glare with a steady gaze, her silence speaking volumes. The tension in the cabin hung thick as Gregory was escorted down the aisle, his every step punctuated by the whispers and murmurs of the passengers. As Gregory disappeared through the plane's front door, a smattering of applause broke out, hesitant at first but quickly growing louder. Danielle exhaled quietly, her hands resting in her lap as she absorbed the moment. A young woman across the aisle leaned toward her. "You were incredible," she said, her voice filled with admiration. "The way you kept your composure? I couldn't have done that." Danielle offered a small smile. "Thank you," she said simply. "But I didn't do it for him. I did it for me." The flight attendants resumed their duties, moving through the cabin to reassure passengers and prepare for the delay's resolution. Officer Carter paused beside Danielle's seat before leaving. "Ms. Brooks," she said, her tone professional but warm, "if you need to file a formal complaint or pursue further action, the airline will provide full support. Just let us know." Danielle nodded. "I appreciate that. Thank you for stepping in." As the officers disembarked, the mood in the cabin began to shift. The tension eased, replaced by a quiet buzz of conversation. Some passengers leaned across aisles to discuss the drama, while others took out their phones to text about the incident. One man in the middle row, still holding his phone, spoke loudly enough for Danielle to hear. "This is going viral, no question. People need to see what folks like her go through." Danielle caught the comment, but chose not to respond. She wasn't interested in becoming a viral sensation or the subject of social media debates. Her goal had never been to draw attention, but to stand her ground against someone who thought he could diminish her. As the plane finally prepared to depart, a flight attendant approached Danielle with a gentle smile. "Ms. Brooks, we'd like to offer you a complimentary upgrade to first class for the remainder of your journey. It's the least we can do after everything you've been through." Danielle hesitated, her instinct to decline warring with the exhaustion she felt. "Thank you," she said after a moment. "That's very kind." She gathered her belongings and moved to the front of the plane, her steps steady and unhurried. As she settled into the plush first-class seat, she allowed herself a small moment of relief. The ordeal was over, and she had emerged stronger for it. Meanwhile, in the terminal, Gregory Wallace paced angrily as airport security spoke to him. His protests grew weaker, his indignation tempered by the realization that no one was on his side. The man who had once commanded rooms with his arrogance was now a spectacle, undone by his own actions. Back on the plane, Danielle gazed out the window as the aircraft finally began its taxi to the runway. The clouds stretched across the horizon, vast and unbroken, a reminder of the limitless potential she carried within her. For all the challenges she faced, one truth remained. She refused to let anyone, least of all a man like Gregory Wallace, dictate where she belonged. Danielle Brooks reclined in her seat in first class, her phone held firmly in her hand as she placed a second call. Her voice, calm but laced with purpose, connected with Michael Grant, a renowned human rights lawyer and an old college friend. She quickly recounted the incident aboard the flight, Gregory Wallace's aggressive tirade, the officer's intervention, and the growing support she had felt from fellow passengers. "This isn't just about me," Danielle explained. This happens all the time to people who don't have the means or the platform to fight back. I need your help, Michael. We need to push the airline to review their policies on handling discrimination. Michael didn't hesitate. You've always had a way of turning adversity into action, Danielle. Send me the details, and I'll get started drafting a formal request to the airline. We'll push for transparency and real change. As the plane continued its journey, the video recorded by a passenger had already begun making its way through social media. The clip captured Gregory Wallace's arrogant sneers, his cutting words, and Danielle's poised responses. The comments section lit up with outrage, admiration, and a chorus of voices sharing similar experiences. By the time the plane landed at its final destination, the video had gone viral. News outlets picked up the story, labeling Danielle a symbol of dignity in the face of prejudice. Hashtags like #StandWithDanielle and #RacismInTheSkies trended globally, and social media platforms were flooded with posts supporting her. Influencers, activists, and public figures weighed in, calling the incident a stark reminder of the biases still plaguing society. The airline, faced with mounting pressure, issued a statement just hours after the video surfaced. We do not tolerate discriminatory behavior on our flights. Effective immediately, Gregory Wallace is permanently banned from using our services. We have also launched an internal investigation to ensure our policies reflect our commitment to equality and inclusion, but the fallout for Gregory was far from over. Within a day, his identity was uncovered by internet sleuths. It turned out that he held a high-ranking managerial position at a prominent tech company. The company's name was quickly tied to the incident, prompting its leadership to issue their own statement. We are deeply disturbed by the behavior displayed by an individual associated with our organization in the viral video. We do not tolerate discrimination in any form. Effective immediately, this individual is no longer employed by our company. The announcement sent shockwaves through Gregory's professional and personal life. His reputation, once built on power and confidence, was now in tatters. Media outlets dug into his past, unearthing stories of his abrasive behavior and prior complaints from colleagues. The scandal escalated, and Gregory's name became synonymous with public disgrace. He was swarmed by reporters wherever he went, his once pristine image reduced to a punchline. Meanwhile, Danielle and Michael Grant worked tirelessly behind the scenes. They collaborated on an open letter addressed to major airlines, calling for mandatory diversity and anti-discrimination training for all airline staff. The letter outlined clear steps for creating safer and more inclusive environments for passengers, highlighting the need for proactive measures rather than reactive apologies. When the letter was published, it struck a chord. Thousands of people shared it across social media, many adding their own harrowing experiences of prejudice while traveling. Celebrities and activists amplified the message, praising Danielle's bravery and vision. The letter quickly garnered over 1 million signatures, turning a moment of injustice into a movement for change. Danielle's inbox overflowed with messages of support and gratitude. Strangers from around the world thanked her for standing up, for refusing to be silenced, and for inspiring others to do the same. Parents shared how they used the video as a teaching moment for their children. Employees in marginalized communities spoke about how the incident mirrored their struggles, giving them courage to confront discrimination in their own lives. As Gregory's life unraveled further, his former colleagues distancing themselves, his social media accounts flooded with criticism, Danielle maintained her focus on the bigger picture. In interviews, she consistently redirected attention away from his downfall and towards systemic change. This isn't about one man, she told a reporter during a televised interview. It's about a culture that allows people like him to think they can act without consequence. It's about creating systems that support accountability and foster understanding. Her words resonated deeply. Advocacy groups reached out, inviting her to speak at conferences and participate in panels. Danielle found herself at the center of a movement, her actions inspiring a groundswell of activism. The airline, feeling the heat from public scrutiny, announced sweeping reforms. They implemented new training programs and pledged to update their conduct policies, promising more robust responses to discriminatory incidents in the future. They even invited Danielle to join a task force aimed at improving inclusivity within the industry. Despite the whirlwind of attention, Danielle stayed grounded. She continued working with Michael Grant, turning their open letter into a blueprint for change across industries. Together, they drafted proposals for corporate anti-discrimination policies, ensuring that employees like Gregory Wallace could no longer hide behind power and privilege. Months later, as the world moved on to new headlines, Danielle received a letter in the mail. It was handwritten, the scrawled signature at the bottom unmistakably Gregory Wallace's. "I don't expect forgiveness," it read, "but I wanted to apologize. You exposed me, not just to the world, but to myself. I see now how deeply ingrained my biases were. I've lost everything, but maybe I deserve to." Danielle read the letter twice, then placed it in a drawer. It wasn't closure she sought, it was progress. And in that, she had already succeeded.